You think kings lived and died like gods, majestic, clean, untouchable. No? If you had been inside Versailles in the late summer of 1715, the smell alone would have knocked you to the floor. Because the man who was once called the Sun King, Louis XIV of France, the most powerful monarch of his age, was rotting alive in his golden palace. Picture this. You are walking through the endless, glittering corridors of Versailles, where crystal chandeliers hang heavy and gilded mirrors stretch endlessly. The palace is meant to dazzle, to remind everyone of Louis's wealth, his power, his immortality. But by 1715, the glitter could not hide the truth. Behind closed doors in the king's private chambers, the most horrifying reality was unfolding. His body was betraying him. One foul-smelling inch at a time, Louis XIV had ruled for more than 70 years, longer than any monarch in European history. He built Versailles as a stage for himself, a living theater where he played the God King. His courtiers bowed, whispered, gossiped, and fought for even the smallest glance from him. He was adored and feared, but by his final year, that godlike image was collapsing, because Louis's leg was rotting away from gangrene. It started small, just a pain in his left leg, a little swelling, a little soreness. But soon the leg began to blacken, the skin turning leathery, the stench creeping through his silk stockings. At first, his doctors tried to downplay it. After all, this was Louis XIV, the Sun King. How could he possibly be dying like an ordinary man? They applied poultices, herbs, ointments, desperate rituals. Nothing worked. The infection spread. Imagine the scene. The king, still dressed in his embroidered robes, lying in his massive golden bed. Around him, dozens of courtiers stand pressed shoulder to shoulder. The ritual of watching the king live was sacred. But now they were forced to watch him rot. The air in the chamber grew thick, choking. People whispered that the smell was unbearable. Some courtiers fainted, yet no one dared leave the room, because turning away from the king, even a dying one, was a dangerous insult. And the king himself? He tried to keep up appearances. Louis prided himself on discipline, on majesty, on never showing weakness. Even as his leg oozed pus, even as the pain made him grit his teeth so hard they cracked, he insisted on continuing the rituals of Versailles. He still received courtiers, still gave orders, still sat upright in his bed like a statue of authority. But everyone could see it. The king was rotting alive. His skin turned gray, his eyes sunken. His once sturdy frame now a skeleton wrapped in silk. And the palace? Versailles became a prison of death. The smell of rotting flesh seeped out of his chamber and down the corridors. Perfumed courtiers dabbed their noses with handkerchiefs, soaked in lavender to survive the stench. But nothing could disguise it. The Sun King was decomposing before he was even dead. Doctors debated surgery. Some suggested cutting off his leg to save him. But others argued the king was too old, too weak, and too sacred to mutilate. They hesitated. Days turned into weeks, and the infection spread higher, eating away at him. By the end of August 1715, Louis XIV was no longer the ruler of France. He was a living corpse, a grotesque shadow of the man who had once terrified Europe. This was no glorious royal passing. This was slow, humiliating decay, and yet Versailles demanded the show go on. Every day, the rituals continued. The lever where courtiers watched the king awaken, the coucher where they watched him sleep. The endless stream of bows and whispers. But now those rituals were hollow. Behind the gold, behind the ceremony, everyone knew. The king was dying in the most horrifying way imaginable. The truth was so ghastly that after his death, France tried to hide it. The official record softened the details. The legend of the Sun King had to remain untarnished. But the reality was filth and rot, the stench of death clinging to velvet curtains. A monarch who had ruled like a god but died like a decaying beggar. And this is only the beginning of his horrifying end. By the end of August 1715, the Sun King was no longer a blazing star. He was a dying ember, flickering in a palace built to worship him. Versailles had always been a theater. Every meal, every glance, every ritual was a performance with Louis XIV at its center. But now the performance had turned into a nightmare. His body was breaking down faster than anyone could control. The gangrene in his leg spread higher, eating into the flesh of his thigh. The stench was unbearable. Servants lit candles of ambergris, filled the air with clouds of incense, drenched fabrics in rose water. but nothing could cover the smell of death. And still the audience remained. Imagine standing in that golden chamber, crushed shoulder to shoulder with dukes, bishops, and ministers, while the most powerful man in Europe lay rotting in front of you. No one dared to turn away. To walk out of the king's chamber while he still breathed was an insult, an act of political suicide. So they endured it. They watched. They gagged behind their perfumed handkerchiefs. They bowed when his milky eyes flickered open. Louis himself clung to ceremony. Even in his agony, he summoned strength to speak. He knew he was dying, and perhaps for the first time in his 72-year reign, he allowed a glimpse of humility to show. He called his 5-year-old great-grandson, the future Louis XV, to his bedside. The child was terrified. Imagine being summoned into that room, the smell of putrefaction choking your throat, the sight of a skeletal old man who had once ruled as a god, now blackened and shriveled in silks. The king pulled the boy close. With a voice that was weak but clear, he whispered, "Do not imitate me in my taste for building or in my love of war. Try, on the contrary, to be at peace with your neighbors, to relieve your people, and to do what I have failed to do myself." It was a stunning confession. This was the same man who had bankrupted France with endless wars, who had built Versailles as a monument to his own ego, who demanded every nobleman orbit around him like planets around the sun. And now at the end he admitted it. He had failed. But death is not merciful, not even to kings. His last days were a slow descent into hell. The gangrene spread. His skin cracked and oozed, his body wasted away. The once proud Sun King was confined to bed, unable to move, groaning in pain, sometimes delirious. He received the sacraments, confessed to his sins, and tried to prepare his soul for judgment. But the spectacle of his death was impossible to hide. Versailles reeked. Courtiers whispered in disgust. Servants fainted. And outside the palace, rumors spread like wildfire. The king is rotting alive. On September 1st, 1715, at precisely 8:15 in the morning, Louis XIV finally died. He had lived for 77 years and ruled for 72 of them, the longest reign of any monarch in European history. But his end was not glorious. It was grotesque, humiliating, foul. And then came the final horror. When his body was prepared for burial, the surgeons opened him for embalming. What they found was worse than anyone expected. His insides were black, his organs decayed, his flesh eaten through by disease. The gangrene had consumed not just his leg, but much of his body. He was already half rotted from the inside out. The embalming failed to stop the decomposition. As his coffin was carried into the royal vault at Saint-Denis, witnesses described a terrible thing. The body swelled from the gases of decay, and the coffin literally burst open. The Sun King, who had spent his life controlling every detail of how he appeared, could not control the last. He exploded. France tried to cover it up. Official records softened the details. The ceremonies of mourning were rich, majestic, carefully staged to remind everyone of his greatness. But behind the pomp, everyone remembered the truth. The Sun King had died in filth and stench, his body betraying him, his power meaningless against disease and decay. And yet even in death, his shadow loomed. France mourned, but also breathed a sigh of relief. After decades of war and extravagance, perhaps the kingdom could heal. Perhaps the little boy who had watched his great-grandfather rot in that gilded chamber would lead differently. History would not be so kind. But that's another story. As for Louis XV, the man who called himself the Sun, his death revealed the truth. No king, no matter how powerful, no matter how adored, no matter how divine he claims to be, can escape the stink of mortality. The Sun King sat not in glory, but in rot.